Hello again, everybody. In today's video, the time has finally come because we're going to be talking about range masking with local adjustments in Lightroom Classic. Range masking is an extremely powerful tool in Lightroom and probably one of the most underappreciated tools as well. Now, I do need to give you fair warning on this one. If you're using the quote-unquote new version of Lightroom, not Lightroom Classic, range masking is not currently available, so this tutorial is not going to be for you. That said, I really do recommend that you stick with Lightroom Classic for now, being that it does have the most complete set of features available to you. Certainly not to say that the new Lightroom doesn't have some functionality that's of benefit, but because of missing features like range masking, I personally prefer to stick with Lightroom Classic for the time being. If you're not very familiar with local adjustments in Lightroom to begin with, I do recommend you check out my Local Adjustments 101 video that I've recently released. That'll give you a deep dive on how to use local adjustments from start to finish within Lightroom and set the foundation so that you can understand what we're talking about as we go into this range masking tutorial today. As powerful as range masking is, it is only available within a local adjustment. So if you don't understand a local adjustment, it's going to be difficult to understand what we're doing with this range masking stuff. Now, with all that out of the way, I'm excited to get into this. Range masking is something I use on almost every single image that I process within Lightroom, and they can really simplify and help you refine some of the complex edits that you might want to be performing within Lightroom. So with all that, let's get right to it. Before I jump totally into this, let me just run through really quickly what range masking is going to let us do as we work on processing some of these images. And actually what I'm going to do here is go from my completed image and show you how I used range masking to hone in some of the edits, and then we'll recreate those so you can see what they've done, and then from scratch see how I created them to get that end result. So when you create a local adjustment within Lightroom, as you may have recalled if you've watched my 101 tutorial for local adjustments, you do have an option at the bottom for range masking. And what that does is it allows you to mask part of the image based on either a color selection or a luminance selection within that image. And that's going to make more sense as we get into this, but it's really letting you refine those selections so that your local adjustment is only going to impact the part of the image that you truly want it to impact. And it's stuff that you can't do with fine brush details or using auto masking on brushes or anything like that. It's far beyond anything you'd be able to do with that. So for instance, if we look at this picture here from Glacier National Park, I have a range mask adjustment applied to a local adjustment that impacts these flowers in the foreground and midground. So if I come up to my brush tool, and I activate my brush, I've already got these adjustments in here. So if I come over and I hover on this particular pen, you can see as the overlay turns on, this adjustment is only impacting basically the flower petals. And like I said, there's just absolutely no way I could go in here with a brush and get this detail and all these little minute pieces of flower that are that exact color range that I want to make the adjustment on them. So if I select this actual pen and activate it, and again, we know it's active because it's got the little black circle within the adjustment pen. So now if I come over to the right panel here with the local adjustment, you can see what I've done on these flowers is I've brought the exposure up just a little bit. I've added some texture to bring a little bit more of the detail back into them. And I've actually brought the saturation down a fair bit because I felt that the purple was getting too intense with the edits that I made globally to the image before I got into the local adjustment side of my processing. As we move further down, again, you can see that I do have a range mask selected here and it's activated for the color range masking. And if I come down to the amount slider and I hold down my Alt Option key, and then click and hold on the amount slider, you can also get an indication of what exactly I've got selected in terms of this range mask. So anytime you're working with a range mask, you can hold down the Alt Option key, and in the case of these color masks, you go down to that amount slider and click and hold while you continue to hold down Alt Option. That's going to give you a very clear visualization of exactly what parts of the image are going to receive the adjustment that you've got created up in those sliders up above. Now, the thing to keep in mind with these types of overlays that you've got here is that white is going to reveal and black is going to conceal. So think of it as any part that's white is the part that's going to be getting adjusted. So now if I turn off that mask overlay and just come back out to this pen and let me delete this out. So I'm just going to right click and delete. So now that adjustment is gone from this image. And if I wanted to come back in and recreate it, I'm going to double click on my effect header here to just clear out all my sliders. I'm going to create a new brush. I know right off the bat that I want to lighten these flowers up a little bit, so I'm just going to pick one of my drop downs and then tweak it as I need to. And if I remember, I had some texture in there, and then I'd also drop the saturation down a bit. So now if I come out to the image and I start painting in, you can see as I'm painting here, I'm obviously not only impacting the flowers, but I'm also impacting all of the greens and the other shades of this image that I don't necessarily want to impact. But this is my starting point. So I'm going to paint these in and just get these flowers to the point where they've got the adjustment I want on them. And then we're going to refine this adjustment by using that color range mask. So now if I press the O key to turn on my red overlay, you can see where I've got that adjustment painted in. And again, very sloppy. It's not refined at all. So it's impacting plenty of parts of the image that I don't want impacted. But again, this is my starting point. So I'm going to hit the O key again to turn off that overlay. And now I'm going to come down and I'm going to hit range mask. I'm going to select color. Now with color, my only option here is then to click on the color range selector or the little eyedropper tool here. And that's going to allow me to come out to the image and I can either just click and it's going to select the color that I just clicked on. So now the other thing I could do is come out here, and if I didn't want to just select a single point of color, I could come in and if I click and drag while I hold the mouse button down, I'm going to be able to select a zone. And that's going to get me a little bit more refinement because I've got some lighter shades of purple, some darker shades of purple. So selecting just a single point isn't necessarily going to get me the entire range of that color I want. So if I do that zone, it's going to do a better job of capturing all that. But I do need to be careful because I might pick up some of the greens as well. So there is some trial and error here. But the other thing you can do is, since I'm in my adjustment tool, I can hold down the space bar and zoom in. And once I'm zoomed in, obviously it's going to be that much easier to select the exact color or little zone that I want without picking up any darker shades that might then spill into the greens or anything like that. So if I come in here and I just click and drag on this petal here and then let go and then back out. Now if I come over and let me deactivate my little eyedropper here by clicking back in that circle where it's quote unquote stored. Now if I come over and hold down Alt or Option and then click and hold on the amount slider, you can see I've got that very refined selection now in place. Again, white is indicating where the adjustment is being made. So if I were to come in here and just hit the O button again to turn on that red overlay, now you can see the difference that that range mask has made by selecting that color range for this particular local adjustment. If I were to come into the range mask menu and turn that off while I leave the overlay turned on, you can see the significant difference it's making in the local adjustment selection I've made. And again, if I were to get rid of this completely, so let me come back out to the image, right click and delete. The only other real possibility I could do here is to use the brush tool with auto masking turned on and try to paint in just on these flowers to make my adjustment. But that is going to be so absolutely tedious. I'd have to really be zooming in and zooming out and moving all over the place. And I'd have to go basically plant by plant here to try to get it. And it's going to be almost impossible for me to do this without accidentally getting that center point crossed over into the greens and then therefore selecting some of the greens surrounding the purple flowers. It's just going to be absolute insanity to try to do that. So this is where really I can't make this adjustment unless I use range masking. In this particular case, the color range masking option. So right off the bat here, hopefully you're seeing really quickly how absolutely powerful this range masking tool can be. So now if I come in here, let me just delete this out. And I have another range mask in here that I want to show you real quickly. And it is on one of my graduated filters. So I'm going to come up and activate my graduated filters so I can see those pens. And it should be on this one. So let me click and make that my active. And if I hover on it, okay, perfect. So I can see that on this graduated filter, I've set it up so in this case, it's only impacting the greens of this foreground part of the image. So if I come over to the panel, I can see on these greens, I'm raising the exposure a little bit, adding some contrast, lifting the shadows, lifting the whites, bringing down the blacks to bring in some more contrast. And then in this case, I'm actually reducing the texture on those greens because I was trying to help the purple flowers pop out a little bit more by drawing out some of the detail in the green that's surrounding them. Let me hit O to turn off the overlay. And again, on this one, it's another color mask. So if I hold down Alt or Option and click and hold on that slider, now you can see we've essentially got the inverse of what that other range mask was that I just went through with the flowers. This time, instead of the purples, I worked on the greens. So let's run through real quickly how we would do this. So let me come back out to this image. I'm going to delete out this graduated adjustment that we've got selected here. And we'll come in and we will create a new one. And we'll just do this quick and dirty for the sake of example. And let me drag this up. And that looks pretty good. And if we recall, we clear these just all out. I was adding just a touch of exposure, adding a little bit more contrast in there. Let's see, I lifted the shadows a little bit, lifted the white just a bit, but I also drew the blacks down to further that contrast, reduce the texture. And let's just say this is what we're going for. But again, you can see that the flowers have changed significantly in terms of their appearance because there's no masking on this right now. So this graduated filter is impacting this entire lower portion of the image. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to come over to my range mask menu. I'm going to come down and select a color mask. Click on the eyedropper tool. I'm going to come out to the image. Now this one should be a little bit easier to make my selection, but we do have some different shades of green here, so we need to be careful. So what I can do actually, if I click and drag, I can select again a zone to get a little bit more of a range of those shades of greens. And you can see already those purple flowers kind of drew back down because now they're not being impacted by this edit. But I still have some kind of different tones of green that I probably didn't capture in that. So if I hold down the Shift key now, and I make another selection, I've now added a second zone of colors or tones that I've added into this mask. So you can see I've got this little eyedropper indicator here to tell me I've picked a zone from this area. And I've got this other one, the first one I made over here. So I know that's where I have a secondary zone selected as well. Now if I hit the O button to turn on my overlay, we can see that I've pretty well excluded those purple flowers and I'm only impacting the green tones in this image. Again, this is something you would never be able to do by trying to brush this in or delete out parts of the graduated filter you've added in or anything like that. There's no way you could be that detailed. So really quickly here, in just a few seconds, you're able to come in, add an adjustment, make the tweaks you want, and then include or really exclude, in this case, because I'm excluding the purples in my selections. You're able to almost perfectly hone in this adjustment to exactly the parts of the image you want. So I think just in these two examples right here alone, we're already seeing really quickly how absolutely powerful range masking can be. And this is just the color piece of it. We'll get into the luminance side of it in just a second, but whether it's a single click to select just a single point of color, that click and drag to select a zone of colors within an image or within a local adjustment, or as we just saw here, use the shift and click and drag, shift and click, you can select multiple points, multiple zones, and really, really dial in that selection for your range mask so you're only impacting the exact portions of the image that you want to as you apply this local adjustment. All right, so let me turn this overlay back off and I'm going to close out of this particular one. And let me show you how I used a luminance mask on this particular image. So I've got a luminance mask for the sky, and that's also on a graduated filter. So I'm going to come up here and just reactivate my graduated filter panel. And I'm going to come out here and I'm going to select this pen here, as I've got some adjustments in here on the sky that I wanted to really hone in, again, impacting the sky, but not necessarily impacting the mountain. So if we come over, we can see I've drawn the highlights down on this particular adjustment, and I've got a luminance mask applied. If I come here, now you see there's a little bit of a difference. You have a range and a smoothness slider, whereas on color, you just have an amount. So the range sliders are going to be telling Lightroom you only want to include or exclude a particular luminance range, so either your darker tones or your lighter tones. And then the smoothness slider is really going to let you hone in on how exact that selection is, whether it bleeds over a little bit or if it's really dialed into just the luminance range you've selected. Just as with the color masking, if I come in here and I hold down the Alt or Option key and then click and hold on one of these sliders, I'm going to get this black and white overlay to tell me exactly where this adjustment is being applied. Again, black parts of the image are not getting the adjustment at all. white parts of the image are where the adjustment's being most applied, and then your shades of gray in between obviously would be lesser zones until it fades out into black. To illustrate the smoothness slider here, let me hold down Alt or Option and click and hold on the smoothness slider. And as I drag this to the left, you'll see this selection becoming much more exact as I reduce the smoothness. If I pull it over a little further, we'll see more and more it's becoming closer to pure black and white and fewer shades of gray. Conversely, if I were to swing it way to the right, you can see it's a much softer selection and not quite as exact. So we're going to take this back, leave ahead at around 43. We'll just leave it there. But again, only those wider parts of the image are being impacted by this local adjustment. And in this case, having the highlights drawn down a little bit. If I come back in here and I were to turn this off, you can see that the difference is that the mountains are being impacted now that I've turned the range mask off. Whereas if I turn that luminance mask back on, I'm really impacting just more of the sky and less of that mountainside. So just as we did with that color masking, let me come out here. I'm going to delete this out and I'll show you how we would do this from scratch. Let me come in here, double click on Effect to clear out all my sliders. I'm going to hold down Shift and pull down so that I can get a nice straight adjustment across my image. And I'm going to come up here. I'm going to do this a little bit more extreme so that's a little bit easier to see. Let me pull down the highlights a fair bit. So you can see we've really brought down those highlights in the sky, but it also impacted the mountains, which I don't want it to impact those mountains as much. So I'm going to come down. I'm going to select my luminance masking. Now if I click and drag on this left slider, I'm going to tell it to exclude this adjustment from the darker tones of the image. If I were to drag on the right side of the slider, I'd be telling Lightroom, I don't want this adjustment to be applied to any of the lighter parts. So the slider that you adjust is the one you're basically pulling the adjustment out of. So I don't want this included in the darker parts of the image. So I'm going to come in here, and typically what I do is instead of just starting to move the slider around, I go ahead and hold down the Alt or Option key as I start playing with the slider. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and drag this over. And I'm just letting this get to a point where I'm happy with what part of the image is getting impacted and what part of the image is getting excluded. And again, I want this primarily to be in the sky. I want to keep it out of the mountains and the foreground. So I'm going to bring this over a fair bit here, but you don't want to bring it over too far. If I bring it all the way to the right, I'm making that area too narrow, and now I'm pulling it out of the sky as well. So you do have to find that happy medium. So let's pull this back over just a bit and maybe back to the right a little bit more. It's a little bit trial and error. Just find that point where you're happy with. And then you can come in and you can play with that smoothness slider as well. So again, Alt or Option, click and drag. And in this case, I'm going to make this a little bit more exact to make sure I'm really impacting more of the sky and less of the mountains and foreground. So I think I'm happy with that. So now if I do a before and after, if I turn off this luminance mask, so that's the image without the luminance mask applied. And that's what my adjustment is doing with it applied. So again, if you watch the sky versus the mountains, turn it off. I've brought the highlights way down in the sky as well as on those mountain sides. Once I add in this range mask, you can see the sky's not being impacted too much, but I'm pulling out or I'm excluding those mountains from the adjustment quite a bit more than what I would be if I wasn't using this range mask. All right, so let's back out of this image and go into another one to show you some other quick examples. So if I come over to this image, this is where pretty clearly I would have used a luminance mask on this one. Now, you could say, well, there are some different colors in here, so why couldn't you do it via color mask if I wanted to just say impact these trees? But the problem with this image is it's fairly monotone, and if you don't have enough of a difference in color, the color masking isn't going to be able to pick up exactly on what you're trying to adjust. So in this case, I've got some very strong differences in terms of luminance between the dark trees and the lighter background and the lighter low clouds. So what I did here is I actually took the brush tool, and if I come over and select it, you can see that this brush tool, I've used luminance masking to hone in on these trees to make the adjustments that you see over on the right panel. So I brought the shadows up, I added some texture in, but I didn't want to do that to the soft background, certainly didn't want to do it to the soft clouds. So this is where luminance masking really came in handy. Now this one, as you can see, there are still some tonality differences within those trees where parts of the tree line here is not as impacted by this adjustment I've made as other parts. Now that's okay. I was really trying to even this particular image out a little bit, but it did take some fine tuning of the sliders to make sure I wasn't excluding too much or including too much and starting to bleed into the trees or whatever the case may be. Now in this particular adjustment, if we come down and take a look a little bit closer, we can see that I've actually drawn the right slider over. So again, as I mentioned just a moment ago, when you move a slider, you're basically telling Lightroom that's the spectrum of the luminance that I want to exclude from this image. So by playing with the right slider, I'm excluding the highlights of the image or the brighter parts of the image, and only including those darker tones. And again, we can get a better representation of this if I hold down Alt-Option, click and hold on the slider. We can see very clearly now exactly which parts of the image I'm impacting with this particular local adjustment. Now, another way you can use these range masks is, let's say I came in here and I wanted to make another edit, but I wanted to actually brighten up this dead tree kind of right along the shoreline here. I could come in and click New on Brush, and maybe I zoom in. And let's say I'm just going to bring that exposure up, and I've got auto masking turned on, so I'm just going to start painting in on this tree and brighten it up. Again, auto masking isn't going to be too bad here, but there's still a lot of little fine branches and stuff that are going to be tough to get without moving that center point of the brush into the darker background. And again, once you do that, your auto masking is going to lose awareness of what part of the image you're really trying to adjust. And we could zoom in further and play with it, but it's a little bit tedious to do it this way. So if I were to delete this out and just say, you know what, I'm going to be sloppy, I'm going to turn off auto masking, and I'm just going to come in here and I'm just going to paint. I'm not going to worry about whether I'm painting on the darker background or the darker water or whatever the case may be. Maybe I want to brighten up that reflection a little bit in the water too. And if I hit my O to turn on that overlay, you can see we've got a very sloppy adjustment selection here. Hit O again to turn that off. Now I'm going to come down and I'm going to create a luminance range mask. And in this case, I want to only include those brighter parts. So I'm going to pull from the left slider here. I'm going to hold down Alt-Option so I can see exactly what I'm doing as I drag this slider. I'm going to drag this over until I get that selection more to a point of impacting only the parts of the image that I actually want to adjust. Now this is where you've got to play a little bit between the range sliders and the smoothness slider, because you can see as I pull this more to the right, I am excluding those dark areas, but I'm starting to also exclude some of the brighter areas that I do want to have impacted by this particular adjustment. So what I can do is now I can come down to the smoothness slider, keep Alt-Option held down, and start pulling it to the left. That's going to help make this more of an exact mask as I pull this over to the left. And now I can come back up, keep the Alt-Option down, and maybe I can pull this left slider on range back a little bit to make sure I'm including those brighter tones that I want to. And I think I'm pretty happy with this. Maybe we pull the smoothness back just a little bit further. And I think we're looking pretty good there. So again, if I turn on the overlay by hitting the O key, you can see I've got a much more refined mask than if I turn off this luminance mask. Very sloppy, much more refined. So let me back out of this one and we'll jump over to one final image here to show you some more advanced techniques that I do with range masking here in Lightroom. And this is where I get into some of my more complicated local adjustments that I create in many of my images and couple that with range masking to create a complex adjustment and refine it into only the areas of the image I want to impact. So in this particular image, I've done a couple things here that impact a good portion of the image, but I still want it to be more refined than just being a global adjustment. So one of the things I do on a lot of images like this is I've already got some sunlight coming in from this upper left corner, but I wanted to enhance that a little bit. And I also wanted to soften this part of the image a little bit as well to give it more of a painterly effect and less of that digital sharpness. And I think I've talked about that in one of my other videos, but it's something I do fairly regularly, especially with woodland images like this. In this particular case, I took a radial filter. So let me just come over and activate those. And I've got this radial filter up here. And what it's doing essentially is enhancing that sun glow a little bit. So I've got the exposure coming up, the temperature coming up, contrast is up a bit. But on the flip side, I've turned down texture to soften it a little bit. I've added some dehaze in there to add a little bit more atmosphere or even a little bit more of a glow effect. So I've got a lot of adjustments in here, but what I don't want is this applied universally across the image on every part, lights and darks and the whole bit. So right now I do have a luminance mask applied in here, and if I turn this off, you're going to see a fairly significant difference. So let me turn this luminance mask off. And now you can see that that sun glow is effectively coming into my shadows here as well, which I don't want. You're not going to be getting sun glow coming out of your shadows. So in this particular case, I'm excluding this adjustment from those darker parts of the image by adding the luminance mask and pulling that left slider over towards the middle some to exclude those darker areas of the image. So now again, if I hold down Alt or Option, click and hold on that slider, you get a better feel for which parts of the image I've excluded. I could even refine this a little bit further to make sure I'm really only bringing this into the brighter parts of the image. Now, the other thing I do in a lot of my images is I'm one of the crazy people that does Orton effect within Lightroom. Generally speaking, you're going to add an Orton effect to images within Photoshop, but I've played around enough. I've gotten to a point where I've got a preset local adjustment created for an Orton effect. And I've got that applied here on this image as well with a graduated filter. So what I do with these is, since I can't do a global range mask on an image, meaning my basic panel, the HSL panel, things like that are globally applied to an image, I can't apply a range mask to something I'm doing there. But a hack that you can do is you just create a graduated filter and you create it outside of the image. So if I click and select this one, you see that the entire gradient part of this graduated adjustment is outside the image. So by the time the adjustment's getting to the image, it's basically a global adjustment, but I'm getting the control of it that I want with the local adjustment controls. And in this particular case, that being, I can erase it out in parts, which we can see I've erased out the adjustment from this particular little plant here a little bit and a little bit off the rock and the top of this rock. But again, I also get the advantage of being able to do a luminance mask on this that I wouldn't be able to do if I just made these same adjustments globally to the image. Let me turn that mask off. And once again, I've got a luminance mask here. I'm excluding the dark tones of the image. And in this case, I've left the smoothness at the default setting of 50. Let me delete this real quickly. We'll recreate it so you can see exactly how I'm doing this. So you can see by taking that off, I lose a little bit of that additional softness and glow of the image. So I'm going to come in. I've already got my Orton effect preset selected. I'm going to come out to the outside of the image, hold down Shift. I'm going to drag from left to right in this case. So now if I hover on this to show the overlay, you can see that the entire image is being impacted equally because the gradient of this graduated adjustment is entirely off the image. But I don't want this to be applied to the darker parts of this image, much like that sun glow. I want the Orton effect, which is adding a little bit of soft glow to the highlights. I only want that in the highlights. So I'm going to come down. I'm going to go to my range mask. I'm going to add a luminance mask. And I'm going to start dialing in by using this left slider to exclude this adjustment from my darker areas of the image. I've got Alt or Option held down on my keyboard while I click and drag on the slider to pull this into exactly where I want it in terms of excluding those darker parts of the image. I can certainly adjust the smoothness here a little bit too if I wanted to really pull it out of the shadows and make sure I'm not impacting those at all. And just like any local adjustment, I can come up here to the brush option. And let's say, again, I want to erase it out of this particular area a little bit. Maybe I don't want it on the rocks. I want to make sure I'm keeping some more of that texture detail in the rocks and the moss that's on the rocks here. You can make all those refinements. And as I hit the O key to turn that overlay back on, you can see where I've erased out this local adjustment from these particular areas of the image. Okay, and with that, you should have a pretty good understanding of how absolutely powerful and how awesome these range masks can be as you work with your local adjustments within Lightroom Classic. I've said it multiple times in other videos, but now that you understand the concepts of this, jump in and play around. Have fun, try different things, and see what you can come up with. Again, anything in Lightroom you can undo. Nothing's going to be permanent, so don't hesitate to just try things out and become more familiar with the tools so that you have an understanding of how you can use them and apply them as you work on your images going forward. To further dial in these types of adjustments, be sure to check out my local adjustment opacity video that I also have available. And don't forget to hit the thumbs up button if you found this one helpful. Also, while you're at it, go ahead and hit the subscribe button so you can follow along as I continue to release more videos in the future. As always, thanks for watching. Let me know if you've got any questions in the comment section. I'll do my best to answer them. And until next time, take care, everybody.